Howdy all, grab yourselves a beer, it is time for some Path of Exile discussion, and today the newest incarnation of the Gladiator Ascendancy was revealed. The Gladiator is a duelist Ascendancy that has both a tanking side, so it's a potentially very durable fighter, and it also has a bleed side that you can spec into. Where the Occultist specialises in becoming tanky through energy shield shenanigans, and the Juggernaut through endurance charges, the Gladiator gets there through block. Block is a fairly challenging mechanic to use properly. What it does is when you suffer a hit, if you can block that, and you can get block chance from shields and from a bunch of other items, if you block it, the hit deals no damage. You still need to watch out for incoming damage that is not a hit. And a common example of this would be bad shit left on the ground when you kill zombies deep in the delve, or when you kill various monsters that explode on death and they leave burning ground behind them. That's not a hit. Anything that deals damage over time is generally not a hit. However, block is an extremely strong defensive layer that gladiators can use alongside medium hit points in order to become extremely hard to kill. One of the most popular Gladiator builds recently has been using Herald of Agony in conjunction with all of the block nodes that the Gladiator can get, and then making an absolute beast of a combatant that is almost impossible to hit, but that has no offense of note at all on the passive tree. All of the offense is tied up in the actual skill, Herald of Agony itself. And then the Gladiator just uses fast attacks in order to apply lots of poisons to gain virulence stacks in order to keep their Herald of Agony, the Agony Crawler alive and going. So that's one of the options that's been popular with the Gladiator in recent leagues. Other options haven't been so popular, and that's largely been because bleed has been seen to be not terrible, but not very strong either. And other Ascendancies have had very strong options for offense. So the Gladiator's focus has been, it's been outclassed in the offensive category, and so people have only turned to it if they've been looking for extreme defense. Now the Gladiator picks up one new major node, and otherwise there's only very minor changes. So let's go through the new things that have been added. There's a new branch that's been added here. Attack speed, movement speed first, but then Arena Challenger. Arena Challenger grants you 2% more attack and movement speed per Challenger charge. Challenger charges are a Gladiator-only effect, and a 25% chance to gain a Challenger charge when you hit a rare or unique enemy whilst in Blood Stance. So Blood and Sand Stance comes from a new aura that hasn't been fully revealed as yet, but that has sort of two aspects to it. You can either be in blood mode or in sand mode, and you will then basically be able to gain as much as 20% more attack and movement speed, which is huge. That's the equivalent of Tailwind in the Deadeye Ascendancy, which is considered one of the main reasons to pick Deadeye by a lot of Archer characters. And you gain a Challenger charge on kill when you are in Sand Stance. So basically, if you're in Sand Stance, you're getting it for killing. You use Sand Stance for killing weak enemies, and I believe Sand Stance gives you a lot of ability to dodge hits and to evade hits. And you will use Blood Stance when fighting a big monster, and I believe Blood Stance gives you an ability to endure hits, but we'll have to see that when the Blood and Sand information is fully revealed. Next up, you gain 10 to maximum Challenger charges. So that's where I was saying that you've got 20% more attack and 20% more movement speed. This is just insane, and this would be a really compelling reason to consider the Gladiator Ascendancy going forward. Next up, the rest of the tree remains the same as it was, but with one significant change. All of these nodes that are highlighted, these are all minor nodes. And what they do now, they used to be 5% increased attack speed when using one-handed weapons. So the Gladiator was locked into one-handed weapons. It had to either go sword and board or dual-wield swords. It's now getting the option to use one big chunky weapon. And all of these nodes used to give 5% for just 5% just for the one-handers. They're now giving less attack speed, only 4%, but you get it whether you're using a one-hander or a two-hander. So this is a slight nerf if you're intending to go sword and board on a gladiator or dual wield, but a considerable buff if you were considering going for two-handers. The reason you might consider two-handers on this character is the bleed shenanigans that it's capable of. So let's quickly have a look at the unchanged section that leads to gratuitous violence. Firstly, you have blood in the eyes as a major node. Attacks have a 25% chance to cause bleeding. Attacks maim on hit against bleeding enemies. 10% chance to blind with hits against bleeding enemies. And enemies maimed by you take 10% increased physical damage. This is just a lot of good stuff if you're interested in inflicting bleeds on enemies. The 25% chance to cause bleeding will help you get that chance to cause bleeding very, very high. And the ability that you've just picked up to use two-handed weapons means that you can do more damage with bleeding. Two-handers are just better for inflicting bleeds than one-handers are. So there's lots of good stuff here, debuffs and the like. And I must say, I really get if you've watched Game of Thrones up to at least Season 4, I get a real Oberyn Martell feeling about these sorts of nodes here. I won't provide any spoilers on that show. Next up, gratuitous violence is the bleed explosions node. Attacks have another 25% chance to cause bleeding. That stacks, so that's 50%. Add in chance to bleed support, and you're pretty much at 100 there. 30% increased damage with hits and ailments against bleeding enemies. Bleeding is an ailment, so that is really good. 30% increased damage with hits as well, so there's lots of extra damage against enemies that are already bleeding. You're going to be using this in conjunction with chance to bleed support, I think, which will give you even more damage, so you're going to be basically doing a lot of bleed damage here. Bleeding enemies that you kill explode, dealing 10% of their maximum life as physical damage. This is amazing. This is the sort of thing that can do tremendous damage. If you hit a pack, and if you hit through a pack, and one of the enemies is much weaker than the others, and you're able to instantly kill that one whilst inflicting a bleed on all of the rest, that first one can explode, and then that explosion can conceivably cause the others to start popping off like popcorn as well. And yeah, that 10% doesn't sound like much, but this can be scaled as well. And 25% more damage with bleeding, that's even more insane. Like that's a flat multiplier on the bleed damage that you're doing. If there's been an overhaul of bleed as a mechanic, then this section of the tree will be extremely good, as will this one. If it hasn't been overhauled, it may be that all that Gladiator is able to achieve is getting a bad series of effects up to mediocrity, or a mediocre set up to a marginally usable one. So we'll have to see what other changes have been made to bleed. Nothing that I'm aware of has been teased yet. Next up, we'll deal with the Outmatch and Outlast side of things. This is the Frenzy charge and Endurance charge section. This is very much for dual wielding. You really want to be dual wielding one-handed weapons to use this. And you'll notice that this is the one that still has 15% increased damage with one-handed weapons. So it is the only one that is still locked to a weapon type. Oh, sorry, I correct myself. There's attack speed and block chance over here as well. But this really does incentivize you for using one-handed weapons, but that's fine because this is the one-handed weapon branch of the tree. 25% chance to gain a frenzy charge on kill with your main-handed weapon. 25% chance to gain an endurance charge on kill with off-handed weapon. So if you've got two moderately balanced weapons, then it's quite realistic that while doing trash, you will always have 3 frenzy charges and 3 endurance charges. Or if your maximums are higher than that because of other things, you may conceivably be at more than that. 10% more physical damage while at maximum frenzy charges. 10% reduced physical damage taken while at maximum endurance charges. Again, it's all about that combination of speed and durability. This is a pretty strong node, and I think that there will be some people that experiment with taking 6, 14, 2, and 4 and largely discounting all of the block side of things. So that's one option that you could do for setting up your Gladiator. The other option, though, is to play to its strengths in block. Now, the block section is this section here, 10, 8, and 12. So let's go through these in order. And in order is actually not in numerical order because for some reason they decided to apply an interesting numbering system here. So firstly, you're going to pick up 7, attack speed and block chance. And you'll notice that this has got 2% chance to block attack damage while dual wielding or holding a shield. 10, Pain Forged. 8% chance to block attack damage if you were damaged by a hit recently. Remember what we were saying earlier about hits versus persistent damage over time effects or degens? This is something that you will have up if you're being hit consistently by small mobs. But against bosses that can one-shot you, you will not have the benefit of Pain Forged active. And that's why actually Gladiators are not as strong at killing all deep in the Delve Mines as Occultists are. 40% increased damage if you have taken no damage from hits recently. So that, again, that gives you an oscillating effect where your first strikes you'll be dealing increased damage, then once you've taken a hit, you'll lose that increased damage and you'll gain much more defense. Cannot be stunned by hits you block, and your counterattacks, so that is riposte and the other related skills, which in the 3.6 era of the game these suck, but they may get better. They deal double damage. That's potentially very powerful. Most players that use those skills don't use them for damage, they use them for debuffs. So, for instance, instead of going riposte, chance to bleed support, melee physical damage, or something like, and linking it up like that, they're more inclined to go riposte, curse on hit, or I believe you can use it with curse on hit, or some other sort of debuff where you're not really trying to deal damage with the skill, you're just trying to inflict some sort of negative status effect on the enemy. If their damage has been buffed, then it may be viable to go for serious damage on those counterattacks. It's not that you can't do them. There are some meme builds that just absolutely max out block chance and then run into the middle of a pack of enemies or even right up next to a boss and block and counterattack every one of their auto attacks. That can certainly be done, but it's just not a particularly effective build. And next up, we have the other aspects of the block wheel, of the block side of the wheel. That's like an anchor, isn't it? I'm going to call this the block anchor. So at the top of the block anchor, we've got Violent Retaliation. +4 to maximum chance to block attack damage. This defaults to 75%, and the higher you can get it, the more powerful your character becomes. 8% increased physical damage for each time you've blocked in the past 10 seconds. 80% increased physical damage if you've blocked damage from a unique enemy in the past 10 seconds. And 1% chance to block attack damage for each time you've blocked in the past 10 seconds. So this is a lot of extra damage against bosses. 80% increased is quite considerable. It's not generally as good as getting 20% more damage or 20% more attack speed from something like Arena Challenger, but 80% increased physical damage is nothing to laugh at. And additionally, you've got this. It's not just going to be 80 because you're going to get this 8% increased physical damage for each block as well as that. So if you've blocked 3 hits in the last 10 seconds from a boss, so say Shaper's auto attacks, if you've blocked 3 of them, then you're dealing 104% increased damage. That's considerable. So this is something that you will definitely want to take if you want to be a block specialist. Last up, we have Versatile Combatant, which is incredibly powerful. Block in general is weak against spells. The reason for that is that it's very easy to get yourself a decent amount of block chance on shields. However, it is very difficult to raise your spell block chance. And so you can be in a situation where a monster that's auto-attacking you for 2500 physical damage a hit, you can pretty much laugh that off because you're regenerating quickly enough that you're just sort of only taking 1 hit in 5, and the few that get through don't hurt you that badly. But spell damage comes along, you get a monster in the back row, starts throwing sparks at you, and even though the sparks might only be hitting you for 600 or 700, they're actually hitting you. Now, Versatile Combatant gives you your chance to block spell damage is set to equal your chance to block attack damage, as is your maximum chance to block spell damage. This allows you to get both of these well up into the 80s, which is an incredibly powerful defensive layer. So for that reason, if you want to be a block specialist, you pretty much must take Versatile Combatant, and you strongly want to consider Violent Retaliation, which then doesn't leave you with much else to choose in the tree. And then at that point, given that you're a block specialist, you're probably using a shield and a one-handed weapon, which makes Outmatch and Outlast mediocre. It's not terrible, but it's not amazing. So you're going to want to either consider taking just Blood in the Eyes, which can feel a bit disappointing because you're so close to Gratuitous Violence, which is such a strong node, but you're not going to be able to take it. Or you want to take Arena Challenger at that point. And I think time will tell which of these is the best way to go. In terms of ways to build around the Gladiator, the first option, which is new, and I'm not sure how effective this will be, but it's something that was not particularly viable in the past, is to try and spec heavily into dealing massive bleeds using a two-handed weapon. Atziri's Disfavor is a unique weapon that's particularly powerful in the early in a league, although it tends to get outclassed by rare items later in the league. It drops from Uber Atziri in the Alluring Abyss, so fairly difficult to get access to, but it's certainly more common than a lot of the other powerful unique weapons, and also it's certainly much more common than powerful rare weapons. You could use a weapon like Atziri's Disfavor, or alternately a weapon like Starforge, which comes from the Shaper, and then spec into Gratuitous Violence, and then just take any other two Ascendancy nodes. I would suggest that you would take the first part of the block tree, so Painforged, because it seems to be the best option, and also Arena Challenger, which is the new option that's been added. Arena Challenger will be excellent. You'll then want to use the Blood and Sand stances, so basically use Blood when you're fighting a boss and Sand when you're fighting trash mobs, and then just see how that goes. In terms of how effective that will be, I think it is too early to say at the moment. We're going to need to see the various overhauls of melee skill gems. The second option that I would consider is the full block Gladiator. So you would take the entirety of the block anchor, and then take any one of the remaining nodes. You'll be using a shield that is defensively set up with the highest block chance you can acquire, and then you will be getting most of your offense from Herald of Agony. So you'll want a weapon that inflicts poisons, and then you'll just be making your attacks up close and personal in melee, and then letting your Agony Crawler do all of the hard work in terms of killing things. This will be something that will be very effective at killing bosses. Agony Crawler is extremely strong at ripping apart bosses, up to and including Uber Elder. Bosses that are much harder than Uber Elder, and these are mostly high depth, very high depth Ahu and Kurgle from the Delve Mines, and potentially some new content in Legion. We'll have to find out. You may get to the point that the bosses start one-shotting you, and at that point, unfortunately, the Gladiator doesn't provide much in the way of defenses. Last up, the other option that I'd have, I mentioned you could take Gratuitous Violence and Arena Challenger on a two-handed build. You can also do this on a two-weapon fighting build, and in that case, you'll be dropping Painforged and picking up Outmatch and Outlast, and you'll have maximum frenzy charges and endurance charges most of the time. You'll have these 10 challenger charges most of the time. In short, you'll be looking like a really fast killing machine. You'll be getting full benefit out of Gratuitous Violence and the bleed explosions, but just a bit less benefit than the two-handed weapon version would get from the actual damage that bleeds do themselves. So this is something I'd consider as a more offensively minded Gladiator. You will then need to find defense elsewhere, so you'll mostly need to find your defenses on the core passive tree. However, you will be getting pretty consistently 3 endurance charges whilst killing trash mobs. You just won't necessarily have them for bosses. I would suggest that this is something, if you want a fast moving, fast attacking melee build, it's something worth considering. And again, it's something that we'll have to just judge based upon the actual damage that that the various melee skills are adjusted to do, which is information we should have over the next week. Anyways, if you've got any questions about this, feel free to hit up the comments below. Otherwise, have a good one.